Frank Dalton, mid-40s, the kind of seasoned DEA agent whose face carried the ghost of every late-night bust and every fallen colleague, adjusted the night vision scope. Below in the humid industrial yard, the deal was going down. "Looks like our boy, on time, Miller," he murmured into his mic. Beside him, Miller, a decade his junior and perpetually brimming with a nervous energy Frank sometimes envied, nodded. Textbook, no surprises, just how you like it, Frank. 7 years they'd been partners, a lifetime in their line of work. Miller was the detail man, the one who remembered every license plate and the specific brand of cheap cologne a suspect wore. Frank was the strategist, the one who saw 3 steps ahead, the quiet anchor. Their rhythm was so ingrained it barely needed words anymore. A glance, a slight shift in posture, and they were on the same page, a bond forged in countless high-stakes moments. Frank trusted Miller with his life and knew the feeling was mutual. When the signal dropped, they moved. Frank breached the main door, Miller covered his back, their movements a practiced ballet of force and precision. The dealers, caught mid-transaction, barely had time to react before they were cuffed and on the ground. "Clean sweep," Miller grinned, holstering his weapon, that youthful enthusiasm momentarily eclipsing the grim reality of their work. Frank offered a rare, tired smile. "Another one for the books, kid. Buy you a beer later." It was more than a question. It was a ritual, a silent acknowledgement of their shared burden and their unbreakable, ironclad bond. The celebratory beers never materialized. A new lead dropped almost immediately, pulling them into another surveillance op. This time, Miller was in charge of the intel stream, meticulously piecing together fragments from a new informant. The target was a mid-level distributor, known for moving product through a series of abandoned warehouses. Miller's intel pinpointed Warehouse 17. Frank, hunched over his monitor in the surveillance van, felt a flicker of unease. "You sure about 17, Miller? My gut telling me 19. They've used it before, same MO." Miller barely glanced up from his tablet. "Nah, Frank, informant was solid on 17, said they moved everything there last night." "It's a bigger score, too." His voice held a slight edge of impatience, uncharacteristic for his usual easygoing demeanor. Frank shrugged it off. Miller was good, damn good, and maybe Frank was just getting old and cautious. The bust at Warehouse 17 yielded a small amount of product, a few low-level runners, and a lot of empty crates. No distributor, no big score. They'd hit a dead end, while a far larger shipment, as they later learned, slipped through a few blocks away. Miller was quiet on the drive back, unusually so. He dismissed it as a bad tip, but there was a subtle detachment about him, a lack of the usual frustration Frank expected after a missed opportunity. Frank chalked it up to stress, the relentless pace of their job. Everyone had off days. The Warehouse 17 incident, initially dismissed as a minor hiccup, became a pattern. Over the next few months, DEA operations across the district started unraveling. Informants were compromised, safe houses were burned, and carefully planned busts dissolved into thin air. It was as if the cartel had developed a sixth sense, anticipating every move the agency made. Each failure chipped away at morale, leaving agents frustrated and increasingly paranoid. Whispers of a mole, of compromised intelligence, circulated through the bullpen like a virus. "It's like they're reading our minds," Captain Davies bellowed during a tense morning briefing, slamming a fist on the table. "Every time we get a solid lead, it evaporates. They're faster, smarter, and somehow always a step ahead." Frank watched Miller across the table. His partner, usually quick with a theory or a cynical joke, was unusually quiet, his gaze fixed on the peeling paint of the wall behind Davies. Frank tried to shake the feeling, the nascent suspicion that had started to prickle at the back of his neck. He told himself it was the pressure, the collective anxiety infecting everyone. But the cartel's newfound sophistication was undeniable. They were evolving, adapting at an alarming rate, turning every DEA advantage into a dead end. The frustration was palpable, a thick, suffocating cloud over the entire department. No one knew who to trust, and no one could pinpoint the source of the leak, only that it was crippling their efforts. The intel for the Kingpin bust was Miller's masterpiece, a culmination of months of work, promising to decapitate the cartel's local operations. Frank, despite his growing unease, had to admit it looked solid. The plan was textbook: hit a remote ranch during a high-level meeting. 12 agents, including Frank, Miller, and half their close-knit team, were deployed. They moved in under a moonless sky, the crunch of gravel under their boots the only sound. Frank took point, Miller right behind him. The ranch house was dark, silent, too silent. The moment Frank's hand touched the doorknob, the world erupted. Automatic weapon fire tore through the night, not from the house, but from the surrounding tree line, a perfectly executed crossfire. It wasn't a raid, it was an execution. Frank dove for cover, the screams of his teammates echoing over the relentless gunfire. He saw Agent Ramirez go down, then Chen. Miller was pinned beside him, returning fire, his face a mask of terror. Frank fought like a demon, adrenaline pumping, but they were outflanked, outgunned. When the cartel finally pulled back, leaving a bloody tableau, only Frank, Miller, and 2 other agents remained. 6 good men gone. In the harrowing aftermath, amidst the sirens and the wails of paramedics, Frank felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. The cartel knew. They hadn't just anticipated, they had prepared. This wasn't bad luck, it was a setup. And Miller's intel, so precise, so confident, had led them straight into the slaughter. Frank looked at his partner, who was openly weeping, and for the first time, a terrifying, absolute certainty began to coalesce. Miller wasn't just detached, he was involved. The suspicion was no longer a flicker, it was a raging fire. The official debriefing was a blur of clipped questions and insufficient answers. Frank, still numb with grief, felt a primal urge to understand. He requested access to all pre-raid intel, every scrap that had gone into planning the Kingpin bust. Late into the night, fueled by stale coffee, he pored over maps, surveillance reports, and Miller's meticulous summaries. The more he read, the more a chilling pattern emerged. Specific details, seemingly minor, were off. A shift change for the ranch's security guards was noted, but the actual asterisk change Frank remembered from a brief drive-by was an hour earlier. A specific gate, supposedly locked, was always left ajar. Each discrepancy, small on its own, became a gaping hole when viewed collectively. It was as if someone had subtly altered the terrain to guide them into a meat grinder. Miller, meanwhile, was a picture of grief and cooperative shock. He attended every memorial, offered condolences to every widow, and tirelessly assisted the internal investigation. He seemed genuinely devastated, often seen with bloodshot eyes and a haunted expression. He even pulled Frank aside, his voice choked with emotion. "I keep going over it, Frank. What did we miss? How did they know?" His act was flawless, deflecting any hint of suspicion away from himself and onto the elusive, omnipresent threat of the cartel. Everyone at the agency lauded his resilience, his commitment to finding answers. Frank, however, saw the performance, the subtle tremor in his partner's hand that wasn't from shock, but from the effort of maintaining his facade. The inconsistencies in the intel now screamed. This wasn't a mistake, it was a blueprint for betrayal. The official investigation into the Kingpin bust ambush moved at a snail's pace, bogged down by bureaucracy and a lack of clear answers. Frank, however, had his own parallel inquiry, one driven by a gut-wrenching need for truth. He started watching Miller, not with the overt surveillance of a DEA agent, but with the subtle, almost subconscious observation of a man whose world had just been shattered. Miller, still playing the role of grieving survivor, seemed to be handling his sorrow remarkably well. Too well. A new, gleaming sports car appeared in his parking spot, far beyond the means of a DEA salary, even with a few years on the force. Frank noticed the glint of an expensive watch on Miller's wrist during a casual conversation in the break room, a timepiece that definitely wasn't there before the ambush. He started keeping tabs on Miller's movements outside of work hours, not actively tailing him, but noticing patterns. Miller, who used to spend his evenings at a local dive bar or playing video games, was now frequently absent, sometimes for entire nights, offering vague explanations about visiting family out of town. Frank also caught him several times on hushed phone calls, stepping away from the bullpen, his back turned, his voice low and indistinct. One evening, Frank saw him leaving a high-end restaurant with a woman Frank didn't recognize, both looking far too comfortable and affluent for a casual dinner. None of these details were incriminating on their own. A new car could be a loan, absences could be legitimate, a new girlfriend. But stacked upon the mountain of Frank's growing suspicions, each new observation was another brick in the wall of Miller's betrayal, solidifying Frank's resolve to uncover the truth. Frank knew he needed more than vague observations. He needed proof. He started digging into Miller's finances, a delicate dance around DEA protocols. One night, while supposedly working late on a cold case, he accessed a secure database. It took hours, but he finally found it. A series of wire transfers, small at first, then growing exponentially, routed through offshore accounts. The dates of the larger transfers often coincided with significant cartel movements, or even worse, with DEA operations that had inexplicably failed. Then there was the burner phone. Frank had noticed Miller using a beat-up, old-model flip phone on a few occasions, always discreetly. It was a long shot, but he managed to cross-reference the number with known cartel contacts, a list he'd compiled over years of busts. The results made his blood run cold. The burner phone had been in constant communication with a number linked to a notorious cartel enforcer, a ghost known only as El Sombra. Even more damning, a flurry of calls between Miller's burner and El Sombra's number had occurred in the hours leading up to the Kingpin bust ambush. The evidence was undeniable. The financial transactions painted a clear picture of a man being paid off, and the call logs were a direct line to the slaughter of his team. The raw, searing pain of betrayal ripped through Frank. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a horrifying, concrete certainty. Miller, his partner, his friend, was a traitor. The cold, hard evidence was a physical weight in Frank's chest, a constant ache beneath his ribs. Miller, his partner, the man he'd shared more late-night coffees and near-death experiences with than anyone else, was a venomous snake. The betrayal was so profound it bordered on existential. It wasn't just a professional slight. It was a personal amputation. Sleep became a battlefield of flashbacks and Miller's smiling face twisting into a sneer. Eating was an act of forced necessity. The office, once a place of camaraderie, now felt like a viper's nest. How could he walk past Miller's desk knowing what he knew and pretend? The urge to scream, to expose him, was a burning ember. But he couldn't. Who would believe him? He was a grieving agent, perhaps unhinged by loss, accusing a decorated survivor. He had no official chain of command for this, no clear path. Going to Captain Davies or anyone in the DEA would risk being sidelined, dismissed as paranoid or worse, alerting Miller. The cartel's reach was insidious. If Miller was compromised, who else was? Frank was utterly alone, marooned on an island of horrifying truth. The memory of the dead agents, his friends, screamed for justice, but the ghost of his long friendship with Miller whispered, "How could he?" Duty wrestled with a shattered loyalty, leaving Frank isolated in a torment of conflicting emotions. Frank moved with the quiet stealth of a predator, his every action now meticulously calculated. He couldn't risk Miller catching on. He began building his case, a shadow investigation within the DEA's walls. He duplicated Miller's burner phone call logs, cross-referencing numbers with known cartel figures and their affiliates. He meticulously documented the offshore transfers, creating a financial map of Miller's illicit gains. One evening, feigning a need for an old case file, Frank strategically steered a conversation with a tech-savvy junior agent about recovering deleted files from agency-issued devices. He subtly probed about Miller's past equipment, particularly an old laptop Miller had turned in for an upgrade months ago. The agent, eager to impress, unwittingly provided the location of the archived hard drive. Frank, under the cover of darkness and a fabricated IT issue, accessed the drive. There, buried deep, were encrypted messages, not random data, but a sophisticated, custom-built encryption program. He spent sleepless nights, using his own personal, untraceable server and a decades-old code-breaking hobby to crack it. The messages, once deciphered, were cold, clinical directives. Times, locations, and personnel movements, the very intel that had led to the DEA's repeated failures and, ultimately, the ambush. They detailed the Kingpin bust setup with chilling precision, even mentioning a bonus for the cooperation. The proof was now overwhelming, undeniable. Frank had everything he needed to expose the betrayal. Frank thought he was being subtle, but Miller was a cop, a good one, and a snake. He must have felt the shift, the subtle chill in Frank's demeanor, the way Frank's eyes lingered a moment too long. The first sign came subtly. Frank's personal laptop, normally locked down tight, developed a glitch, a sudden, inexplicable hard drive crash that wiped critical files, including his meticulous notes on Miller's financial transactions. He knew it wasn't a coincidence. Then came the office politics. Frank found himself subtly undermined in meetings, his suggestions dismissed, his insights questioned. Miller, ever the loyal partner in public, began subtly isolating Frank. He'd forget to include Frank on emails or accidentally schedule overlapping meetings. During a debriefing, Miller casually mentioned, loud enough for others to hear, how stressed Frank seemed lately, hinting at his grief over the ambush affecting his judgment. One afternoon, Miller cornered Frank by the water cooler. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but his eyes were hard. "You've been asking a lot of questions, Frank, about me, about the ambush. Some things are better left alone, don't you think, for everyone's sake?" The implied threat hung heavy in the air. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. Miller knew the game had changed. Frank was no longer just an investigator, he was a target. The veiled threat from Miller had been chilling, but it was the message left on Frank's personal cell phone that night that truly solidified his grim reality. The number was blocked. The voice, digitally distorted, was cold and flat, devoid of emotion. "We know what you're doing, Agent Dalton. You're digging in places you shouldn't. Stop, or you'll end up just like your friends, tick-tock." The call ended abruptly, leaving Frank staring at the phone, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. It wasn't just Miller now, the cartel was aware. They had eyes and ears everywhere, even reaching into his private life. They knew he was onto Miller, which meant his window of opportunity to act was closing rapidly. He was no longer just gathering evidence, he was in a race against time, his life the ultimate stake. The threat forced his hand. He couldn't go to the DEA now, it was too risky. The leak was clearly higher than he initially suspected, or the cartel was simply too deeply entrenched. He needed to confront Miller directly, to force a confession, or at least get him to expose himself further before the cartel silenced them both. The thought of losing more colleagues, of becoming another casualty of Miller's betrayal, propelled him forward. There was no turning back. The fight was personal now, and he had to win. Frank set the meeting for an abandoned warehouse down by the docks, a place familiar from old busts now crumbling and forgotten. "Need to talk, Miller. Something important, just us." Miller arrived, his usual swagger replaced by a wary caution. The air crackled with unspoken tension. "What's this about, Frank? You've been acting weird." Miller's voice was a practiced blend of concern and annoyance. Frank didn't waste time. He pulled out his battered laptop, setting it on a dusty crate. He clicked open the files, the detailed financial transactions, the call logs to El Sombra, and finally, the decoded messages from Miller's old DEA laptop. The cold, damning words scrolled across the screen. "Target ETA 200, personnel count 12, Dalton confirmed lied." Miller's eyes, wide at first, narrowed to slits. His face, usually so expressive, became a mask of stone. "What is this, Frank? Some kind of joke?" His voice was low, laced with a venom Frank had never heard. "Joke," Frank's voice cracked, raw with a pain that ripped through him. "Ramirez, Chen, Davies, every single one of them. Their blood is on your hands, Miller. You fed them to the wolves. For money. For what? A goddamn sports car." He slammed his fist on the crate, the old wood groaning. 7 years, Miller. 7 years I stood by you, trusted you with my life. You were my brother." Miller finally dropped the act, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Brother, don't be naive, Frank. This is a game, and you're losing. What are you going to do?" Tell internal affairs, they'll laugh you out of the building, and if they don't, the cartel will ensure you never get the chance. His eyes held a chilling emptiness, devoid of any remorse, only cold, calculating contempt. You think you've got me, you've just signed your own death warrant. Miller's chilling words had barely faded when the first bullet ripped through the corrugated metal wall of the warehouse, spraying sparks and dust. Frank instinctively dove, pulling his service weapon. Miller, surprisingly quick, also hit the deck, his face now a mask of genuine fear, not the feigned kind. "What the hell?" Miller yelled, scrambling for cover behind a stack of old tires. "They know, Miller, they heard us," Frank shouted back, returning fire blindly towards the source of the shots. He'd anticipated Miller's reaction, but not this. The cartel, always one step ahead, had likely had the warehouse under surveillance, waiting for Frank to make his move. Now both their lives were forfeit. They had served their purpose, and now they were loose ends. More gunmen poured into the warehouse, their silhouettes stark against the moonlight filtering through the bullet holes. Frank and Miller, once partners, now found themselves in a bizarre, desperate alliance against a common enemy. The irony was a bitter taste in Frank's mouth. The man who had betrayed him, who had caused the deaths of their friends, was now fighting for his life beside him. Frank saw Miller take a glancing blow to the arm, grunting in pain, but still firing back with grim determination. This wasn't about friendship or justice anymore, not in this moment. It was about survival. They were both targets, trapped, and the cartel intended to silence them both permanently. Frank's years of street experience kicked in, a raw survival instinct honed in countless firefights. He knew this warehouse better than the cartel hitmen. "Down the far aisle through the loading bay," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Miller, surprisingly, followed without question, their movements once again a grim, improvised ballet. They ducked and weaved, using crates and abandoned machinery for cover, Frank providing suppressing fire while Miller covered their retreat. He led them to a hidden access tunnel, an old maintenance route Frank had discovered years ago. "Go," he yelled, pushing Miller ahead, then tossed a flashbang behind them before diving in himself. The tunnel led them to a back alley, several blocks away. Breathing heavily, Frank pulled out his encrypted USB drive, the one containing all the damning evidence. "This is going to the top, Miller. You're done." Miller, bleeding from his arm, looked at Frank with a complex mix of fear, defeat, and something akin to a twisted respect. "You won, Frank," he rasped, his eyes haunted. "But you just proved their point. No one's safe." Before Frank could respond, Miller slumped against the wall, unconscious from blood loss. Frank didn't hesitate. He secured the evidence, then used Miller's own cell phone to call for an ambulance and backup, carefully obscuring their location for safety. Justice for his fallen team and the truth of Miller's betrayal would finally come to light. The cartel's elaborate network of deceit was about to unravel, thanks to the very man they tried to silence. Miller would face a reckoning, alive to answer for his crimes. The fallout was seismic. Frank's evidence, irrefutable and meticulously gathered, blew open the cartel's local operations and exposed Miller's years-long betrayal. Miller was arrested, his pleas of coercion and fear quickly drowned out by the weight of the digital forensics and the testimony of Frank. Frank, once an isolated paranoiac, was hailed as a hero, his name whispered with awe in the halls of the DEA. He received commendations, a promotion was hinted at, but the accolades felt hollow. He visited Miller in federal lockup, a stark, sterile room separating them by thick glass. Miller looked older, broken, but the coldness in his eyes remained. "It was never personal, Frank," Miller said, his voice flat through the phone. "Just business, you should understand that." Frank just stared, the ghost of their 7 years together a phantom limb that still ached. "It was personal the moment you sent our friends to die, Miller." He didn't want answers. He wanted to understand how a bond forged in fire could be so easily extinguished by greed. Back in his apartment, the silence was deafening. The job continued, the cartel's influence weakened but not gone. Frank was back on the streets, but he felt a profound shift. The unwavering trust he once held for a partner, for the system itself, was irrevocably shattered. Every new face was met with a flicker of suspicion, every intel brief scrutinized with a jaded eye. He had brought justice, but the cost was a part of himself, a wound that would never fully heal. The lingering scars of Miller's betrayal were etched deep, a permanent reminder of the true price of his relentless pursuit of truth.